It's chapter 7, and it turns out we're reading a science fiction novel. Let's figure out what that means. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. Chapter 7 sees the division of the two worlds of Kathy's time at Hailsham. The turning point of this comes when she speaks to Tommy at the pond. And this change is when Kathy begins to question the world around her, and Miss Lucy is her best lead. The first incident that Kathy notices concerning Miss Lucy happens when Miss Lucy is leading a poetry lesson on World War II poets. Suddenly, the students start talking about the fences at the prisoner of war camps and how they could be electrified, how touching one could kill you. The students are laughing about this and acting it out. But Kathy is watching Miss Lucy. Here's what she says. Through all of this, I could see, just for a second, a ghostly expression come over her face as she watched the class in front of her. Then I kept watching carefully. She pulled herself together, smiled, and said, "It's just as well the fences at Hailsham aren't electrified. You get terrible accidents sometimes." She said this quite softly, and because people were still shouting, she was more or less drowned out. But I heard her clearly enough. You get terrible accidents sometime. What accidents? Where? But no one picked her up on it, and we went back to discussing our poem. So what does this discussion of the fences at Hailsham have to do with this? Is the focus on suicide, escape, entrapment, humanity itself? Whatever it is, Miss Lucy's watching this class, and she's made quite sad about some sort of accidents that we don't know anything about yet. But bookmark this in your reading of the novel because we'll get to it again later. The more important incident happens during a game of rounders, which from the best of my knowledge is kind of like baseball. Those of you in the UK, help me out a little bit with this. But or Great Britain, or Ireland too, not just the UK. Rounders turns into sheltering under the pavilion. And it's during their last year at Hailsham when they're 16. And Miss Lucy is standing there watching the rain, and she overhears two boys talking. And she tells us perhaps one of the most important pieces of information about our plot so far. Listen to this. Miss Lucy says, "No, Peter, I'm going to have to stop you. I can't listen to you anymore and keep silent." Then she raised her gaze to include the rest of us and took a deep breath. "All right. You can hear this. It's for all of you. It's time someone spelt it out." We waited while she kept staring at us. Later, some people said they thought she was going to give us a big telling off, others that she was about to announce a new rule on how we played rounders. But I knew before she said another word, it would be something more. "Boys, you must forgive me for listening, but you were right behind me, so I couldn't help it. Peter, why don't you tell the others what you were saying to Gordon just now?" Peter J. looked bewildered, and I could see him getting ready his injured innocence face. But then Miss Lucy said again, this time much more gently, "Peter, go on. Please, tell the others what you were just saying." Peter shrugged. "We were just talking about what it would feel like if we became actors, what sort of life it would be." "Yes," Miss Lucy said, "and you were saying to Gordon you'd have to go to America to stand the best chance." Peter J. shrugged again and muttered quietly, "Yes, Miss Lucy." But Miss Lucy was now moving her gaze over the lot of us. "I know you don't mean any harm, but there's just too much talk like this. I hear it all the time. It's been allowed to go on, and it's not right." I could see more drops coming off the gutter and landing on her shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice. "If no one else will talk to you," she continued, "then I will. The problem, as I see it, is that you've been told and not told. You've been told, but none of you really understand, and I dare say some people are quite happy to leave it that way, but I'm not. If you're going to have decent lives, then you've got to know and know properly. None of you will go to America. None of you will be film stars, and none of you will be working in supermarkets, as I heard some of you planning the other day. Your lives are set for you. You'll become adults. Then, before you're old, before you're even middle-aged, you'll start to donate your vital organs. That's what each of you was created to do. You're not like the actors you watch on your videos. You're not even like me. You were brought into this world for a purpose, and your futures, all of them, have been decided. So you're not to talk that way anymore. You'll be leaving Hailsham before long. It's not so far off. The day you'll be preparing for your first donations, you need to remember that. If you're to have decent lives, you have to know who you are and what lies ahead of you, every one of you. So that's that. And as we reflect back on what we've read so far, this idea of these students growing up to donate in air quotes, their vital organs becomes clearer. We think back to the fact that they have to take weekly medical exams. All of a sudden, smoking and how serious it's taken about their health becomes even clearer than it was before. And there's all sorts of other little clues that have been building up to this. There's still a lot of mystery to this novel that I'm excited, if you're reading it for the first time, for you to uncover as you read. But that's a big bombshell that's just been dropped. And there's kind of a conspiracy for the characters of how the Guardians conveyed this disturbing information, because, as Miss Lucy says, these students have been told and not told. Tommy's theory is that they were always too young to understand. Kathy's theory is that they combined the knowledge of the donations with the knowledge of sex, and because they're adolescents, they focused on the sex and not the donations, both of which are probably true, whether the Guardians are intentional about this or not. And it's in this reflection on their discussions with sex, which are much more open and clear than probably what any of us are used to in our times in school. I mean, Miss Emily does some unusual things to a skeleton, we're told. And at one point in the chapter, Kathy says, according to what she's listened to in Miss Emily's lecture, that out there we have to behave like them. This is the talk about sex and how the students apparently cannot conceive children. So their view of sex is very different from a view of sex that can procreate. And that's another big mystery that we'll get into in future chapters. But we're now understanding that eventually these students are going to leave Hailsham and go out into the quote-unquote real world that's not protected by the walls of Hailsham, where they're not creating art. And there's a lot of mysteries with that, but they're going to go out into the real world, and at some point in their early adult lives, after they've fully matured, they're going to have to donate their vital organs. And this reminds Kathy of another incident back to when Tommy was being bullied. He hurt his elbow, and poor Tommy was convinced that if he bent his elbow, it would unzip and fall out, like the bones would fall out. So he's carrying it like perfectly straight, and he very innocently asks Kathy, and kind of adorably asks Kathy to create a splint for him so that his elbow won't bend at night. And what's really interesting to me, and it's the last thing I want to talk about with this chapter, is that Kathy doesn't tell him the truth. Later on, Tommy discovers it, and he's ridiculed by everyone in the school, who now use the word unzip as a euphemism for the donations. But what's interesting to me is that Kathy doesn't tell him the truth. And if Kathy's exchange with Ruth and the pencil case tells us anything, it's that Kathy really values the truth. But there's this sort of protective deception, even protective ignorance on the case of the students, because the truth is that they are going to die very young. They're going to die a terrible death of having your organs taken out of you. And that's probably pretty hard to think about. So maybe because of that, the novel walks away from this a little bit, and the end of the chapter sets us up to talk about these guardians who have taken it upon themselves to raise students who are destined or fated for this donation process. And we'll get into that in chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed the reading. The novel keeps picking up and just keeps gaining momentum all the way to the end. Stick with it. Keep reading. It gets better and better and worse and all sorts of things. And we'll talk about it next time.